There are moments when another person's presence seems to awaken something unsettling within us, not because they are cruel or unkind, but because they stir a version of ourselves we'd rather forget. Beneath the surface of irritation lies a quiet confrontation with our own shadow. The repressed emotions, fears, and desires we've long disowned. What feels like dislike is often recognition. What feels like distance is self-defense. In truth, relationships serve as mirrors, reflecting not who they are, but who we become in their presence. This is not hatred, it is the psyche's subtle invitation to return to wholeness. When they trigger you, it's not about them. Have you ever noticed how certain people can reach a part of you that no one else can? Not through tenderness, but through tension. It's as if their presence brushes against an invisible bruise beneath your skin. They say something harmless, yet you feel your body tighten. A tone, a gesture, a silence. And suddenly you're no longer responding to them, but to an echo within yourself. This is what psychologists call a trigger, but the deeper truth is far more intricate. A trigger is not a sign of someone's power over you. It's evidence of a dormant wound being awakened, a place within the psyche still asking to be seen. When Carl Jung wrote that everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves, he wasn't describing moral superiority. He was describing the architecture of projection, the way consciousness mirrors itself through relationship. In our everyday lives, we think we dislike certain people because of who they are. We call them arrogant, manipulative, selfish, distant. But if we slow down, we might see that what unsettles us in them is often something unacknowledged in ourselves. Their arrogance provokes our own buried insecurity. Their manipulation mirrors our secret desire for control. Their distance reminds us of the coldness we once used to protect ourselves. What we call dislike is often recognition. A form of psychic déjà vu. It's the unconscious whispering, "You've met this part of yourself before." The human psyche is a network of reflections constantly casting images outward to reveal what remains unseen within. In relationships, these reflections become emotional mirrors. A friend's criticism might expose the self-judgment you hide beneath composure. A lover's withdrawal might awaken the child who learned to equate silence with abandonment. The trigger in this sense is not an attack. It's an unveiling the psyche using another person as a stage to replay its unfinished stories. I remember a conversation with a friend years ago. He spoke with a quiet authority that I mistook for arrogance. Each time he interrupted me, irritation flared. Later that evening, I asked myself why his confidence provoked me so deeply. The answer came slowly, like light filtering through water. It wasn't his confidence I resented. It was my own suppressed self-assurance, the part of me that learned to shrink in rooms where being bold felt unsafe. He didn't humiliate me. He mirrored the self I had abandoned. When you understand this, conflict begins to lose its teeth. You stop seeing others as villains and start recognizing them as unwitting teachers. Their behavior still matters, of course. Boundaries remain essential. But beneath every discomfort lies data. Emotional reactions are messages from the subconscious, each carrying information about where you've been silenced, unseen, or unloved. In Jungian psychology, this process of seeing through projection is a doorway to individuation, the lifelong work of becoming whole. The people who trigger you are not random. They're precisely aligned with your unfinished integration. Like mirrors angled toward your blind spots, they reflect not your failure, but your evolution in progress. It takes humility to recognize this. The ego prefers to stay righteous. It wants to point outward. They did this to me. They make me feel small. Yet awareness asks a subtler question. Why do I need them to change so I can feel safe? That question doesn't accuse, it liberates. Because once you see that your emotional charge belongs to you, not them, you reclaim your agency. Think of the psyche as a vast house with rooms you've forgotten. Every relationship knocks on a different door. Some open easily, others reveal dust, clutter, and shadows. The person who triggers you is simply the one who happens to open the door you've avoided the longest. It's tempting to run to label them toxic, to retreat into solitude, to curate a life free of discomfort. But spiritual and psychological growth rarely happens in the absence of friction. It unfolds in the subtle tremors of self-recognition the moment you realize that what you're avoiding is not the other person, but a version of yourself that still aches for inclusion. The next time you feel that familiar spark of irritation or defensiveness, pause before reacting. Ask yourself, what part of me is being reflected right now? Notice the sensation in your body, the tightening chest, the shallow breath, the heat in your face. That physiological response is the language of the unconscious, a somatic bridge between memory and meaning. Beneath it lies a story, often an old one, waiting for acknowledgement rather than judgment. To be human is to live in reflection. We discover ourselves through others, not in their praise, but in the discomfort they stir. The mind prefers harmony, but the soul grows through contrast. The person who unsettles you might unknowingly be carrying the mirror that reveals the next threshold of your evolution. In that light, the trigger becomes sacred. It's not an obstacle to peace. It's an initiation into deeper awareness. Each moment of irritation, jealousy, or hurt is an invitation to turn inward, not to fix, but to understand. Because when you see that the storm belongs to you, no one else can control your weather. So when someone provokes you, resist the urge to turn away. Watch the emotion rise, trace its outline, and ask, what is this moment trying to show me about myself? That question alone transforms the dynamic. Suddenly, the person before you is no longer an adversary, but an unwitting mirror in your unfolding psychological landscape. This is where the journey begins, not with changing others, but with seeing clearly the self they awaken within you. The trigger is not about them. It's about the parts of you still waiting to come home. 2. The hidden self that sabotages love. There's a quiet paradox that lives beneath every human connection. We crave intimacy, yet we fear being seen. We want to be loved for who we truly are, but the moment someone gets close enough to see the unpolished edges, we instinctively pull back. What we are protecting, often unknowingly, is the shadow self, the hidden constellation of emotions, impulses, and memories we've exiled in order to survive. Carl Jung described the shadow as the thing a person has no wish to be, It's everything we've disowned: our anger, envy, neediness, or fear, traits we were taught were unacceptable. But the paradox is this: what we repress doesn't disappear. It waits. It hides beneath politeness, beneath intellectual control, beneath the persona we show the world. And in our closest relationships, it inevitably finds a way out. The shadow doesn't surface in grand psychological moments. It appears in the small ruptures, the sigh when your partner forgets to listen, the jealousy that flares when a friend succeeds, the cold withdrawal after a simple disagreement. It's in those moments we meet the part of ourselves that still believes love must be earned, safety must be controlled, and vulnerability must be hidden. In relationships, the shadow self often becomes the silent saboteur. We project our unmet needs onto the people we love, demanding from them what we have not yet given ourselves. We interpret distance as rejection, silence as punishment, disagreement as betrayal. The past and present collapse into one, and suddenly we're no longer adults having a conversation, but children reliving an old wound through a new face. I once knew someone who seemed endlessly composed, graceful, rational, detached. But when intimacy deepened, their calm became control, and affection turned into withdrawal. They weren't being cruel. They were protecting the child inside them, who learned that emotions lead to chaos. Their shadow wasn't malevolent, it was terrified. Beneath every controlling gesture was a plea. Please don't let me feel unsafe again. This is how the shadow speaks, not in words but in defense mechanisms: control, avoidance, perfectionism, or overgiving. Each defense carries a secret logic. If I can manage your perception of me, I can prevent rejection. But the tragedy is that these protections also prevent connection. We can't be loved for who we are if we're always busy managing who we appear to be. The moment love feels threatening, the unconscious takes over. We might become distant, argumentative, overly apologetic, or cold behaviors designed to keep the shadow out of sight. Yet, ironically, these very reactions pull us further from the intimacy we long for. The lover we accuse of being emotionally unavailable may simply be holding a mirror to our own unavailability. The friend we resent for being self-absorbed might be reflecting the part of us that struggles to express need. The psyche seeks wholeness, not comfort, and so it uses relationships as alchemical vessels, places where hidden material rises to the surface. Love in this light is not a refuge from the self, but a mirror that amplifies it. Each time you find yourself blaming or retreating, you're standing at the threshold of transformation. You can choose to repeat the pattern or to pause long enough to ask, what part of me is asking for attention right now? Shadow work in relationships isn't about fixing the other person or even fixing yourself. It's about cultivating awareness, noticing the subtle shifts between reaction and reflection. It's learning to sit with discomfort long enough to recognize that what you're feeling belongs to you, not to them. It's the difference between saying, "You make me feel invisible," and quietly realizing, "I feel invisible, and I've felt this before." This awareness doesn't erase pain, it dignifies it. It turns conflict into information, emotion into insight. The shadow, when brought to light, transforms from a saboteur into a guide. It reveals what parts of you are still waiting to be integrated, the anger that hides behind charm, the need that hides behind stoicism, the grief that hides behind composure. True intimacy begins when we no longer demand others to carry what we refuse to hold. It begins when we can look at our partner or friend and see not a source of discomfort, but a mirror reflecting our next lesson in wholeness. And yet this kind of awareness is not easy. The ego resists exposure. It wants to stay in control. But healing requires surrender, a willingness to sit with the unknown and trust that whatever arises is not there to shame you, but to free you. So the next time you feel that surge of defensiveness, jealousy, or withdrawal, pause. Instead of fighting it, trace it. Ask yourself, when did I first learn that love required protection? Who taught me that being seen meant being hurt? That inquiry alone is shadow work in motion. The act of turning unconscious pain into conscious understanding. Because ultimately the shadow isn't your enemy. It's the part of you that wants to return home to be accepted, not for your perfection, but for your humanity. And when you finally meet that hidden self with compassion, you'll discover that love no longer needs to be a performance or a battlefield. It becomes what it was meant to be all along, a space where truth can breathe. When you reach that level of seeing every argument, every emotional trigger, every silent retreat becomes an opportunity for reclamation. You stop asking, "Why do they keep doing this to me?" and begin wondering, what is this trying to teach me about who I am? The hidden self doesn't need to be exorcised, it needs to be embraced. Because only when we integrate what we once rejected can love finally flow without distortion. The shadow doesn't destroy love, denial does. And every act of awareness, every quiet moment of truth, brings us closer to a love that no longer needs protection. Only presence, the you that you can't stand to see. There's a peculiar discomfort that arises in certain relationships, not the pain of betrayal or rejection, but the quiet unease of seeing yourself reflected in ways you didn't expect. It's subtle at first. You notice how you become smaller around certain people, more apologetic, more eager to please. Or perhaps the opposite, more defensive, more reactive, more controlling than you thought yourself capable of. You walk away wondering, why do I turn into someone I don't recognize around them? This is the invisible theater of the psyche, where every relationship becomes a mirror, and every mirror shows you a different version of who you are. Jung once wrote that one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. In this context, that darkness isn't always dramatic. Often it's painfully ordinary. The insecure self, the jealous self, the one who still seeks validation through silence or overperformance. Each person we meet holds the potential to awaken a version of us that has been waiting in the shadows. Around one person you become nurturing, around another competitive, around someone else fearful. These are not masks, but fragments, aspects of the self that were shaped through survival. And when the wrong or right combination of traits in another person meets the unhealed terrain within us, those fragments rise to the surface. We tend to judge these shifts as proof of inauthenticity. I hate who I become around them. But what if that reaction isn't a condemnation, but an invitation? The discomfort may not be a sign you're broken. It may be the psyche's way of saying, look here. This is where you've split from yourself. I once spoke with a woman who said she felt pathetic every time she was around her ex-partner. She described how confident she was in every other area of life, her career, her friendships, her solitude. Yet around him, she became uncertain, needy, easily dismissed. It's like he brings out the weakest version of me, she said. What she didn't see then was that this version wasn't created by him. It was revealed by him, the echo of a younger self still carrying the belief that love must be earned through self-erasure. When we say we hate someone for how they make us feel, we're often expressing the hatred we hold for our own disowned parts, the ones who still kneel for approval, who fear abandonment, who carry the remnants of an unfinished story. That hatred is self-directed, disguised as judgment. It's easier to call them toxic than to admit I'm still healing from the part of me that once needed their validation. The versions of you that appear in relationships are like archetypal actors on the stage of consciousness, each carrying a symbolic truth about your inner narrative. The pleaser reveals where love was conditional. The controller reveals where chaos once ruled. The detached one reveals where feeling once became too painful to bear. When these characters step forward, it's not regression, it's retrieval. The psyche is showing you in living color the places that still await reintegration. In that sense, every relationship is a kind of psychological mirror labyrinth. The people who cross your path are not random. They correspond to particular dimensions of your growth. Each interaction shines light on a different contour of your identity, not to shame you, but to remind you of the self you abandoned to survive. But this process can feel humiliating. To witness yourself regress into old wounds is a profoundly human vulnerability. You might think I've evolved beyond this. Why am I back here again? Yet healing is not linear. It moves in spirals. Each repetition offers a deeper layer of understanding, a chance not to perform strength, but to practice gentleness toward the parts of you still learning to trust safety. When you catch yourself becoming that version again, the one you swore you'd outgrown, try not to recoil. Instead, observe with quiet curiosity. Who is this version trying to protect? What does she still need that I've ignored? Often beneath the behaviors we resent lies a simple truth that we once had to become these versions to survive environments that couldn't meet our emotional needs. What was adaptive then becomes constricting now, but the impulse behind it was never wrong. The real task isn't to destroy these versions, but to bring them into conversation with your present self. To say, I see you. You did what you had to do, but we're safe now. This internal dialogue transforms what was once shame into understanding. And from that understanding emerges a quiet liberation, the freedom to inhabit all your dimensions without self-rejection. When you can hold these conflicting selves with compassion, your relationships begin to change. You stop oscillating between overgiving and withdrawal because you're no longer trying to outrun your shadow. You respond instead of react. You listen to discomfort without surrendering to it. You begin to see that the people who trigger your regression are not regressions at all. They are thresholds. Every version of you exists for a reason. The angry one, the fearful one, the one who clings, the one who shuts down. Each carries a fragment of wisdom, a message from your psychological evolution. When integrated, they become not liabilities, but allies, teachers in your own curriculum of awareness. And perhaps that's the quiet truth about love and connection. The people who bring out the worst in you are often the ones showing you what remains unloved within you. They are not here to punish you, but to complete your understanding of yourself. To look at these parts without flinching, that is shadow work in its purest form. It's not glamorous, it's not soothing, but it is sacred. Because every time you meet that unwanted version of yourself with compassion instead of contempt, you reclaim a piece of your wholeness. So the next time you catch yourself thinking, "I hate who I become around them," pause. Take a breath. You don't hate that version, you fear her. You misunderstand her purpose. She's not your downfall. She's your doorway. And beyond that doorway lies the freedom to love without losing yourself to see, without projection to exist, without fragmentation. Because in the end, integration isn't about becoming someone new. It's about remembering who you've always been, even in the versions you once couldn't stand to see. Told wounds wearing new faces. Sometimes the emotion that floods you in the present has nothing to do with the moment at hand. A partner's brief silence feels like abandonment. A friend's criticism lands like humiliation. A colleague's success awakens a sudden, inexplicable envy. These reactions seem disproportionate, too much for the situation, and yet they feel undeniable, even primal. That's because they are. They are not merely responses to now, they are echoes from then. In psychology, this phenomenon is known as emotional transference, the unconscious redirection of old feelings onto new people. It's what happens when the psyche, still carrying unprocessed pain, projects the past onto the present in an attempt to resolve what was left unfinished. The person before you becomes a symbolic stand-in, a living canvas upon which old emotional imprints reappear, disguised as current experiences. Jung called these reappearances psychic repetitions. Freud described them as the compulsion to repeat. But beyond theory, the experience is deeply human. We don't just remember the past, we relive it through the tone of someone's voice, the pace of a text reply, the look in their eyes that reminds us, however faintly, of a moment when we first learned what it meant to be unseen. I once worked with a woman who grew up with a distant, emotionally unavailable father. She built a brilliant life, successful, independent, admired. Yet in every relationship she found herself drawn to men who mirrored that same emotional distance. "I don't know why I keep ending up here," she said. "Every time they pull away, it feels like my world collapses." Her tears were real, but they didn't belong solely to the man before her. They belonged to the child inside her, still waiting for her father to turn toward her and say, "I see you." This is the essence of transference, the emotional time-traveling of the psyche. It's as if the mind carries a hidden script from long ago, one that keeps casting new actors into old roles, hoping that this time the story will end differently. But until the pattern is seen, it repeats itself with uncanny precision. You can recognize transference by its intensity. When your reaction feels exaggerated compared to the actual situation, you're likely dealing with memory disguised as emotion. The colleague's remark that leaves you fuming all day. The partner's delay that spirals you into panic. These are signals, not flaws, invitations to trace the thread back to its origin. The work begins with a simple question. I felt this way before when that sentence written with honesty becomes a compass through the labyrinth. It directs you toward the original scene, the first wound that taught you how love, safety, or attention were earned or withheld. When you discover that root, something shifts. The current relationship no longer carries the full weight of your past. You stop demanding closure from people who were never responsible for your earlier pain. You begin to see that your partner's withdrawal is not your father's silence, that your friend's criticism is not your mother's disapproval. They are new people, but until your nervous system learns the difference, every interaction will feel like déjà vu. Transference is not a psychological defect, it's a survival mechanism. The mind repeats what it doesn't yet understand in order to integrate it. The child who once felt powerless recreates familiar dynamics not to suffer, but to attempt mastery. Unfortunately, until awareness intervenes that mastery remains out of reach, we unconsciously recreate the wound instead of resolving it. Awareness, however, transforms repetition into revelation. When you can pause in the middle of a charged emotional moment and ask, "Whose face am I really seeing?" you interrupt the old pattern. You reclaim your present from the ghosts of your history. It's in that pause that compassion enters. The adult self can turn toward the inner child and say, "I know this pain." But it's not happening again, it's remembering. That single distinction softens the entire experience. You're no longer drowning in emotion, you're witnessing it. You're no longer trapped in the scene, you're holding it with consciousness. Sometimes awareness arrives through writing. Sit with the emotion and complete the sentence, "I felt this way before when." Write without censorship, not for logic, but for truth. Let the associations flow. You might find yourself revisiting a classroom, a kitchen table, a childhood bedroom. You might see the moment when you first learned that love disappears when you make mistakes, or that silence means danger. These are not just memories, they are living imprints. Seeing them consciously is the first act of freedom. And sometimes awareness arrives through stillness, through noticing the body. The body, after all, keeps the score. That constriction in your chest, that tremor in your hands, that impulse to run, they are messengers of the past communicating through the language of sensation. When you breathe into them rather than resist them, they begin to unfold their story. Transference is the psyche's attempt at healing disguised as confusion. It repeats not to torment you, but to bring you back to what remains unloved. The moment you realize that relationships stop feeling like battlegrounds and start feeling like classrooms, each encounter becomes an opportunity to rewrite the narrative, to respond differently, to stay present, where you once withdrew to speak truth, where you once silenced yourself. Because the truth is, you're not overreacting, you're remembering. The tears, the anger, the fear, they are time travelers from an earlier chapter of your life asking to be acknowledged. And when you finally see them for what they are, you begin to separate the past from the present. You can look at the person before you and say, "This isn't my father, this isn't my mother, This is me meeting myself through another. In that moment, the pattern begins to dissolve. The old wound no longer needs to wear a new face. You've recognized it, and in doing so, you've freed both yourself and the people around you from the weight of your unhealed history. That is the quiet power of awareness. It doesn't erase the past, but it ends its repetition. It allows love to meet you in the present, unfiltered by memory, unshadowed by fear. How blame keeps you stuck in the same story. Blame is one of the psyche's oldest defense mechanisms, elegant in its simplicity, seductive in its relief. When something hurts, the mind seeks an external culprit. It must be them. The one who dismissed you, the one who lied, the one who didn't care enough. Naming another as the source of pain offers temporary coherence to the chaos inside. But beneath that sense of righteousness lies a quieter truth. Blame freezes us in the very story we're trying to escape. To understand why we have to look at how the ego operates. The ego is a storyteller. Its purpose is to preserve continuity, to protect a coherent sense of self. When we are hurt, that continuity fractures. The ego rushes in to restore order, crafting a narrative where someone else is responsible for our suffering. It's not a malicious act. It's a survival reflex. Yet every time we assign fault outwardly, we surrender inward growth. We remain characters in the same old plot, reenacting the same emotional scripts, only with new faces and new names. This is the psychology of projection. Jung described projection as the transference of one's own unconscious contents onto another person. In other words, what we cannot face within ourselves, we locate in others. We call them controlling when we fear our own impulses to dominate. We accuse them of indifference when we have numbed ourselves. We judge them for dishonesty when we are avoiding truths within. Projection isn't a moral failing, it's a mirror disguised as accusation. Consider a moment of anger, that heat rising in the chest when someone dismisses you. Beneath it, there's often something more vulnerable, the old wound of not being heard. But anger feels powerful, grief does not. So we cling to the easier emotion pointing outward, while the deeper truth remains unspoken. In doing so, we keep the wound alive. I once met a man who couldn't stop talking about his toxic ex. Every story was an indictment how she manipulated, criticized, diminished him. The details were convincing. Yet after a while, I noticed a pattern in his language. She always mirrored a quality he quietly carried. He accused her of emotional withdrawal, yet he himself retreated the moment vulnerability appeared. He called her controlling, yet his own fear of uncertainty had turned affection into surveillance. When I asked him what he feared most in that relationship, he paused and said, "Losing control." The irony was luminous. Control had already cost him intimacy. That's the hidden cost of blame. It protects the ego from humility, but robs the soul of freedom. Each time we choose accusation over reflection, we defer our own evolution. We keep orbiting the same emotional planet, mistaking motion for progress. The names change, the settings shift, but the underlying pattern remains identical because the lesson has not yet been learned. Blame, in essence, is emotional stasis. It keeps the wound in a state of preservation. Healing requires movement inward, a willingness to ask, What part of me keeps attracting, tolerating, or repeating this experience? That question dismantles the illusion of powerlessness. It shifts the focus from the external offender to the internal architect. But this kind of self-inquiry can feel threatening. The ego equates self-responsibility with self-blame, yet they are not the same. Self-blame is shame. Self-responsibility is liberation. The former condemns, the latter illuminates. To take responsibility for your part in a dynamic isn't to excuse another's behavior. It's to reclaim the agency to respond differently next time. The process begins with awareness. The next time you catch yourself saying, "They always make me feel," pause. Replace "they" with "I." Try the sentence again. "I feel invisible when they interrupt me." Suddenly the tone shifts from accusation to introspection, from battle to dialogue. You move from seeking vindication to seeking understanding. When you do this consistently, you'll notice something subtle. The people who once triggered you begin to lose their power. Their behavior may still sting, but it no longer defines you. You stop needing closure from them because you've begun to give closure to yourself. The energy that once fueled resentment is redirected into awareness. And awareness, by its very nature, transforms pain into insight. Blame is comfortable because it keeps us righteous. Awareness is uncomfortable because it keeps us honest. Yet honesty is the only bridge between repetition and renewal. Without it, we stay trapped in the circular architecture of projection, falling in love with the same archetypes, arguing the same arguments, building the same walls of silence. There's a beautiful line by James Hollis. "We are doomed to repeat what we do not understand." That's the essence of psychological patterning. The partner who leaves becomes another chapter in the saga of abandonment. The friend who betrays revives the childhood memory of trust broken too soon. Until we see our role in maintaining these narratives, they persist not because life is cruel, but because the psyche is patient. It will repeat the lesson until we learn to see differently. Breaking free requires humility, the courage to admit that the person we're angry at is also the person through whom our unconscious is trying to teach us something. That doesn't mean staying in harmful dynamics. It means walking away with consciousness rather than bitterness. It means saying, "This hurt me, but it also showed me what I still need to heal." Every moment of blame conceals an unacknowledged truth. Beneath, they made me feel worthless lies. I believed I was unworthy long before they arrived. Beneath, they never listened as I learned to quiet my voice long ago. This isn't about taking on more guilt. It's about tracing pain back to its origin, so it no longer dictates the present. The ego protects, but the soul evolves through awareness. When you understand that even the act of forgiveness changes shape, forgiveness stops being about excusing others and becomes about releasing yourself from the gravitational pull of the same story. You stop rehearsing what went wrong and start rewriting what comes next. So when you find yourself blaming someone for your pain pause, ask, what truth is this blame trying to hide from me? Sit with that question longer than your comfort allows, because on the other side of that discomfort lies clarity, and with clarity comes the power to choose a new narrative. Blame says, "They did this to me." Awareness whispers, "This is how I can grow." And somewhere in that shift from accusation to ownership, from reaction to reflection, the entire story changes. The characters remain, but the ending finally evolves. 6. Turning triggers into teachers. Every emotional trigger holds a story, and every story holds an opportunity for awakening. We tend to experience triggers as interruptions, as inconvenient storms that disrupt our peace. But if we look closely, they are not interruptions at all. They are invitations. Each trigger is the psyche's way of saying, "Here lies something unresolved. Here is where you can grow." The modern mind often treats discomfort as pathology, something to fix, suppress, or escape. Yet in psychological and spiritual traditions alike, discomfort is sacred. It is the heat that softens the metal of identity, allowing the rigid structures of ego to yield to transformation. When you learn to meet your triggers with curiosity instead of resistance, they cease to control you. They become teachers whispering truths you were once too afraid to hear. A trigger at its essence is an activation of memory, the body remembering what the mind has forgotten. You feel your heart race, your breath tighten, your thoughts spiral. The body is not betraying you, it's alerting you. It's saying, "We've been here before. Let's try something different this time." To work with triggers consciously requires a shift in perspective. Instead of reacting, you pause. Instead of defending, you inquire. You begin to understand that awareness itself is the solvent of pain. Because what is observed with compassion cannot maintain its hold. There's a simple yet profound practice that begins this process. Pause, name, and listen. When you feel triggered, do not rush to interpret. Pause long enough to let awareness settle between stimulus and response. Name what you're feeling with precision. This is rejection. This is fear. This is shame. Naming emotion with honesty brings it out of the fog of reaction and into the field of consciousness. Then listen not to the story in your head, but to the sensation in your body. Beneath every feeling lies a message. What does this sensation want to tell you about your unmet needs, your unspoken boundaries, or your forgotten grief? This approach mirrors the contemplative practices found in depth psychology and mindfulness traditions alike. Jung saw awareness as the act that transforms the unconscious into the conscious. In Buddhism, awareness is liberation itself, the moment you witness the mind's activity without fusing with it. The two perspectives converge on one. Truth awareness transforms repetition into revelation. When I began practicing this, I noticed how often my anger wasn't about others at all. It was about the part of me that felt unseen, the one who had spent years moderating his truth to avoid conflict. The trigger wasn't the other person's fault. It was my own silence finally demanding a voice. The moment I understood that anger shifted from being an enemy to an ally, a compass pointing toward self-expression. Every emotion carries such wisdom when we stop moralizing it. Jealousy can reveal what we secretly desire. Sadness can show where we've lost connection. Fear can expose what we still value deeply. Even resentment, when traced to its roots, often leads to unmet boundaries or unspoken truths. The question is not how to get rid of these feelings, but what are they asking me to see? Turning triggers into teachers also means cultivating a compassionate relationship with yourself. When you notice the pattern resurfacing, the same reaction, the same withdrawal, the same fear, don't respond with frustration. Respond with tenderness. Say to yourself, "Of course this hurts. I've been carrying this for years." Compassion, not condemnation, is what allows the old wound to unfold. As Jung wrote, "We do not heal by rejecting the darkness, but by making it conscious." Here's a simple framework to anchor this practice. Step 1. Awareness. Notice when the emotional charge arises. Pause before reacting. Step 2. Inquiry. Ask, what am I really reacting to, or when have I felt this before? Step 3. Compassion. Acknowledge that this feeling is valid even if it's misplaced. Step 4. Integration. Express the truth that the trigger has revealed through writing, conversation, or quiet reflection. Each time you do, you reclaim energy that was once trapped in suppression. Over time, you begin to realize that the people who once provoked you are not enemies, but mirrors. They hold up reflections of your own growth edges. The trigger loses its sting because you're no longer unconsciously reacting, you're consciously learning. It's important to remember mastery doesn't mean you no longer feel triggered. It means your awareness expands faster than your reactivity. You still feel the surge, but instead of drowning in it, you become the witness, calm, curious, capable of choice. In this way, your inner landscape transforms. Every argument becomes a lesson in communication. Every disappointment becomes a lesson in self-worth. Every moment of shame becomes a lesson in acceptance. Life ceases to be a series of problems to solve and becomes a curriculum of consciousness. The alchemy of growth lies here in the willingness to let life teach you through the very emotions you once ran from. Triggers are not signs of weakness. They are signs of readiness. They indicate that your psyche believes you are finally strong enough to confront what was once unbearable. So the next time you feel that rush of emotion, the tightening chest, the flood of thoughts, the urge to escape, pause. Let it rise. Let it speak. Ask it gently. What are you here to show me? In that moment, you step out of the old pattern and into awareness itself. The trigger becomes the teacher. The pain becomes the practice. And through that practice, peace no longer depends on life being calm. It depends on you being conscious. When awareness feels like loneliness, there's a subtle ache that often follows awakening, not the chaos of confusion, but the quiet sorrow of clarity. When you begin to see with new eyes, the world you once knew doesn't always recognize you anymore. Conversations feel thinner, laughter echoes differently, and the places that used to feel like home no longer hold the same warmth. This is not regression. It's the inevitable solitude that accompanies consciousness, what Jung might have called the loneliness of individuation. To become more aware is to outgrow certain illusions. You start noticing how much of human interaction is built on unconscious performance. The polite masks, the habitual drama, the endless seeking for validation. When you stop participating in these exchanges, it can feel like stepping out of a crowded theater into the cold night air. The silence is startling. The stars are clearer, but you are alone. Awareness changes the frequency of your relationships. You no longer tolerate conversations that orbit around complaint. You stop chasing approval that costs your peace. You begin valuing authenticity over belonging, and with that comes the gentle eggs of the awakened. People may interpret your calm as distance, your detachment as arrogance, your boundaries as rejection. They don't see that what you're practicing isn't withdrawal, it's truth. You're learning to love without losing yourself. This phase of isolation can feel like loss, but in truth, it's a recalibration. You are adjusting to the stillness that comes when external noise no longer defines your worth. What you once mistook for connection, overextension, emotional caretaking, constant availability begins to feel heavy, unnatural. The nervous system, long addicted to chaos, doesn't know what to do with quiet, so it calls the silence loneliness. But what you're really feeling is space. In that space, your perception shifts from relational dependency to spiritual autonomy. You begin to understand that solitude isn't the absence of love, it's the presence of self. For the first time, you can hear your own voice without interference. You notice the subtler movements of thought and emotion. You recognize your patterns before they act themselves out. Awareness grants you freedom, but it also demands that you face the emptiness that freedom reveals. I remember the first time I experienced this after years of internal work detachment reflection. I found myself sitting across from people I'd known for years, realizing that I could no longer relate to their conversations. They were speaking in the language of comparison and control, and I no longer knew how to respond. I didn't feel superior. I felt estranged. There was grief in that moment. I was watching my old self dissolve, the one who belonged through conformity. Awareness had changed my rhythm, and not everyone could hear the new music. This is the paradox of awakening. The more conscious you become, the fewer people you can share it with, yet the deeper your capacity for compassion grows. You stop trying to fix others because you understand how complex their suffering truly is. You listen more. You speak less. And somewhere between empathy and detachment, you discover a quiet kind of belonging, not in people, but in presence itself. Psychologically, this phase mirrors what mystics and depth psychologists alike call the sacred solitude. It's the period when consciousness reorients itself after shedding identification with the collective. It feels like exile, but it's actually integration. You are learning to live from the inside out. The relationships that survive this transition are the ones built not on projection, but on resonance. Two aware beings meeting without the need to complete or rescue each other. Still, it takes time to trust this solitude. The ego mourns its old attachments. It confuses silence with abandonment. But slowly something else emerges, a sense of wholeness that doesn't depend on company. You realize you were never truly lonely. You were just surrounded by noise that drowned out your own essence. When awareness deepens, life simplifies. You stop over-explaining. You stop negotiating your boundaries. You begin to see that peace isn't something you achieve. It's what remains when you stop betraying yourself. And yes, there are moments of ache, moments when you miss the warmth of shared illusion. But those moments pass, replaced by a steadier warmth, the quiet joy of authenticity. In the end, awareness doesn't separate you from others. It simply redefines connection. You no longer seek it through dependency, but through presence. You realize that true companionship isn't about merging, but about witnessing two consciousnesses meeting in freedom, not fear. So when awareness feels like loneliness, remember, you haven't lost the world, you've stepped outside of its trance. You are not exiled, you are returning. The silence that surrounds you now is not absence, but arrival. It is the sound of your own soul, unfiltered, finally speaking back. Awareness is not an escape from life, it's a return to it unfiltered and awake. You don't hate them, you're simply seeing through the illusions that once defined you. Every relationship, every trigger, every silence has been guiding you back to yourself. So honor the loneliness, honor the growth, and let awareness soften into peace. If this reflection spoke to you, subscribe to Depth Psychology today, a space for those who seek to understand the unseen layers of the mind and to walk the quiet path of inner transformation with depth, courage, and truth.